Okay. All right, our next session we're going to do is a legacy series. It's my humbleness that I like to introduce our next speaker. She is the immediate past president for the Society of Vascular Ultrasound. She's a woman that knows everything. She's a very wise sage.
He taught me everything I know.
And she'll take a picture without you looking in a heartbeat. It's my privilege to introduce Anita Harrington. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is George in the room? Thank you, George. So George and I had a conversation, I believe it was in maybe 2001 in San Diego at the back of the general session. And the conversation went such that there's so many people and so many things that have happened over the period of time that it was important that we preserve that. And so when I became president, I presented the idea to the board, and the legacy committee was formed. And so I want to acknowledge George. Thank you. So the purpose of this committee is really to share the people, the technology, and the important contributions of individuals and companies or corporations, and to preserve it on the SVU website. Marguerite Marlowe was appointed as the chair of this committee at its inception and has worked tirelessly to move this to where it is today. This is the third in a series of the presentations, and the presentation today is Joseph F. Polak. In the process of putting this presentation together, Marguerite and I worked together tirelessly, and there were 9 different conversations. 3 of those folks are seated here. 8 hours of video, countless photos reviewed, several audio reviews, and many, many conversations. And I apologize for those that didn't get included in this. So the culmination of this is really a 22-minute presentation, which is longer than the session here. So I apologize, Karen, in advance. And while Marguerite's not here, I want to acknowledge her and her continued persistence in making this whole presentation and the whole series possible. So today, in the third presentation of the legacy, we present Joseph F. Polak. I want to note that Dr. Polak was on the legacy committee when he served as the chair of the publications committee, and he had direct input into the way that we put this together. His passing left a huge void. Josh, myself, and the board of directors benefited from Dr. Polak's discussions. We didn't always agree, but we agreed to disagree. And his discussions, conversations, and his guidance were innumerable. We're grateful and want to acknowledge additionally Dr. Larry Needleman for his willingness to fulfill Dr. Polak's remaining term on the board of directors. And his contributions have been equally priceless. For the Polak presentation today, we asked 4 different questions of the 9 individuals in which we had a discussion. We asked them, how did you meet Dr. Polak? What was your professional experience with him? Do you have a personal story you'd like to share? And what is Dr. Polak's impact on you and or the vascular field? We didn't include everything. There was 8 hours, but we do want to share with you all of the interviews that we accumulated. These are the folks that we spoke with. And first up was Dr. John Pellerito. He was instrumental in the discussions that we had, and he talks about Dr. Polak's contributions and his generosity.
So Joe and I, as you may know, were program directors of the current practice of vascular ultrasound course, which we did for 25 years. And I met Joe at one of these vascular ultrasound meetings in 1995. It was a meeting I will never forget because not only had I just met him, and he was a bit of a legend to me, but when we were speaking on the panel together, he was particularly challenging and provocative. Over time, we after working together, I asked him to co-edit my book on the introduction to vascular ultrasonography. He had a very solid reputation in the academic community.
Right.
He had written many landmark articles, and he spent his career, proving his theories and writing original articles. And those articles really became the standards for our practice for carotid, venous, and arterial diagnosis. And I think that was the basis for his greatness. He took nothing for granted. He took part in the Framingham heart study. He did so much work on intimate medial thickness. He came up with criteria for carotid stenosis. He also was very instrumental in developing criteria for arterial stenosis. And this is, the basis of what we do now. It's the work that he did back then that serves as the basis for a lot of the studies that we do. I credit Gene Stranis and the group at the University of Washington and Joe Polak for a lot of what we do right now. For this interview is, some of the characteristics that I admired most about Joe. And certainly one of them was his generosity. He would spend time with people who were interested to learn, not just about his work, but just about, using ultrasound in medical practice, how to improve care to patients. They felt his aim was true. He was really dedicated to medicine and to patient care. And I always felt that came through. I have many personal stories that I would love to share, but I think they'd be better suited at the bar at SVU.
The next person, Anne-Marie Kopinski, worked with Joe tirelessly through a lot of different talks and presentations, and she talks about meeting, quote, a name for the first time.
I'm going to guess that I first met Joe at an SVU meeting because SVU was the first professional organization I joined back in 1986, so almost 40 years ago. Is that right? When you're a new person and you meet a name, a name associated with articles and textbooks, and it's very intimidating. And certainly I was intimidated, but within seconds that sort of apprehension faded away. Joe struck me right from the start as somebody who's not only super intelligent, but also very willing to listen to you no matter what your ranking in experience was. The best thing I think about him is his sense of humor and, again, putting people at ease, and you knew you were with somebody who was pretty darn brilliant and important, but he never portrayed himself as that. He had no airs about him, just a funny guy, taking over and working with Dr. Pellerito on his textbooks. I know countless people who use them and have used them, myself included. But you're right. I think, the information he has shared about hemodynamics, even when perhaps he hasn't participated in a particular publication, he's been wonderful at helping to digest it for others and, bringing out potential, strengths and weaknesses in other research, and that's always helpful when you're learning, because that aids in your ability to critically think. His smile is in all our memories and certainly missed. But that he was a class act. Yes. Well, I hope there's some awesome wine in heaven for him.
Next up is Dr. Gene Zeeler, who I think we're all familiar with. He shares Dr. Polak's appreciation of food, wine, and his most recent publication.
Professionally, he is one of the few
a relatively small number of radiologists who make vascular ultrasound their major interest, although he was interested in a lot of other things as well.
Right.
And he had a really strong grasp of vascular laboratory testing as well as vascular imaging in general. And he was also a very good scientist. One of the things that I relied on him most for sort of advice and analysis was his involvement with the Framingham study and intima medial thickness, cardiovascular risk factors, things like that. He was involved in some of those early studies, and he was a good resource for me when I was doing some work on that. He was also very involved with carotid duplex criteria. And he really enjoyed sort of debating and discussing all the nuances of that. And in fact, just within the past year, he did a article for the Journal for Vascular Ultrasound that looked at some of the changes in the carotid criteria over the years. And I was very appreciative of him doing that. When he was president of the ICAVL, one of the things you get to do is pick the locations for the meetings and some of the social events that go on. And Joe had a sort of a passion for good food and good wine. And so when we had our ICAVL board dinners, they tended to get a little bit extravagant, at least by our usual standards, and we had to make some adjustments in the budget for his wine preferences. But we all benefited from it. He didn't keep it to himself. He shared it with us very, very generously.
Next up is Sandy Katanek here with us today. Sandy also agreed that Joe loved wine, but she shared with us that Joe served as the president of the ICAVL, which is now the IAC, and was instrumental in bringing the radiologist perspective to the IACVL board. Here's what Sandy had to say.
I'd heard of Joe Polak. I'd been in the vascular field since 1983, and everybody knew Joe Polak. His reputation preceded him. Just amazed at how much research he had done. And I found it very interesting that he did a lot of community research in his Framingham study, with his Framingham heart study. Right. And so he was always looking at how vascular disease and vascular diagnosis affected communities as a whole.
What's the one gift or the one thing that he brought to the accreditation group that kind of stood out?
I think given his, early tenure on the board, it was a radiology perspective that many of us did not have, but he didn't make it intimidating or, we're the end all to beat all. It was a very inclusive sort of introduction to radiology and where radiology fit. And because intersocietal, and that was from the beginning and by design, that was sort of the base of our creation, was always that, we tried to bring on every specialty that had anything to do with vascular imaging. And vascular technology, so that every perspective would be heard from. But and Joe did it in such an unintimidating way. Joe was always willing to give an unbiased recommendation of who would be a good fit for the board and who would be a good fit for furthering the mission of ICAVL. When you talked about he prided himself on no conflicts, one of my notes here say he had a rock star reputation. And the other thing that I so appreciated from him is how much he talked and loved his daughter.
Next up, also here in the room today, is Jean Alessi-Chinetti. She worked with him for probably 40 years intermittently. And Jean shares Joe's impact of watching his hands as he scanned.
I mean, he dedicated a large portion of his career not only to physician education, but sonographer education. I mean, his meticulous diagrams in his presentations and in his book, just complimented and explained his written word. And he was so proud of those diagrams. He'd, come look at my new diagrams. I'm sure he's done that to you, Anita. Come look at my diagrams. And, but they told the whole picture. And, he was very proud of his diagrams. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and he cared for all his patients. I know that. Have him come in, explain something, and watch him scan. And the one thing I remember when I was watching him scan, he's like, now look at my hand. See the way I have my hand placed. So I spent more time watching his hand placement than I did what was on the screen lots of times. Mm-hmm. And now I take that with my students when I have students and say, look what's on the screen, but also watch my hand.
Next up is Robert McLaughlin, also here in the room with us today. And Rob is a local vascular technologist and has had a lot of exposure with Dr. Polak. And Rob very nicely sums up Dr. Polak in a car ride.
Joe was always in a hurry. Mm-hmm. So he always had things to do. He always had, he was casual, affable, friendly, but he was a busy guy. And he was always doing meaningful things. So I remembered that. So those were the two impressions. One was, the casual exterior, but I think inside, it's sort of like the duck in the water. Above the surface, everything looks calm and relaxed. And beneath the surface, the feet are going 100 miles an hour. And a small group of us had lunch after a local GBVT tech meeting. Mm-hmm. Ada was there, of course. It was at the Mass College Pharmacy. And, of course, Joe spoke, delivering one of the countless talks he gave to our local group over the years. Mm-hmm. And I was giving Joe a ride home to his house in Jamaica Plain. It was on my way. Joe, of course, said he would walk. But because he didn't want to inconvenience anybody, right? That was just Joe. And the ride wasn't that long, but I remember on the way, Joe was going on and talking excitedly, as he often did, about, I think it was some concept in physics. Mm-hmm. And I didn't get a word. And sometimes I would just nod my head, but I'm like, you know what, Joe, I don't get it. And so much like Joe, he quickly and emphatically said, no, it's simple. It's simple. It's simple. I'll explain it to you. And he approached it in a little bit different way, and it was a little bit more understandable. And the car ride, it was Joe and me to a point. He was rapidly juggling that conversation, talking about a manuscript he had to finish, editorial work he was doing, and occasionally giving me directions on a very winding, somewhat hair-raising Jamaica way. And Anita probably knows that road. You feel like you're going to die with the oncoming traffic 6 inches away. So there was also a quick back and forth about our respective favorite Pinot Noirs. I'm not quite sure we saw eye to eye on that. And then, Joe, of course, didn't want to inconvenience me with a turn off the Jamaica way to reach his house. So he said, just drop me off there by the side of the road. I was pulling over, and I remember Joe was hopping out of the car before he even came to a full stop because jumping Joe had more things to do. Fragmented conversation. You're catching pieces of this and this, and you're trying to drive the car, and the conversation is all over the place. His legacy lives in all of us who experienced him, and his legacy lives in all of the writings that he left us. Mm-hmm. They're all valuable, and they're all conversations with Joe Polak. Joe embraced life.
Right. Yeah.
When you look at the mission statement for SVU, I really think Joe embodied it. He never accepted that you couldn't understand something.
Next up was Marcia Newmeyer, who was instrumental in suggesting other people that we would speak with. But, Marcia shares his love for life and love for him and fun.
That's what Joe wanted. He didn't want us as friends hovering over him.
Right.
He wanted to leave us in his own way. He loved vascular diagnostics, and he loved learning, and he loved sharing what he learned with other people. I mean, that was absolute joy to him. What stood out about Joe was the fact that he had such an insatiable curiosity about everything related to vascular disorders, and not only how we treated them, but our diagnostic criteria, how they affect the patients, what was the involvement of the technical team and the physician team. It was all encompassing, yet one of the favorite things that we would always talk about, just the two of us, and he'd get everybody else involved, was it better to angle correct parallel to the vessel wall, or should we angle correct to the flow jet that we could see by color? And he would get Dr. Kremkow involved, and he'd get everybody around him involved. He'd love to sort of query everybody and bounce his own ideas off of people. He didn't preach to you. Right. He wanted to know what you thought. He has just developed such a legacy that he has left with us.
Right.
That I think any of us in the profession that haven't Googled him or gone to PubMed and pulled up all his papers or picked up a textbook and read it, we're cheating ourselves. We're losing something. And I just can't think of anybody that has made such a volume of valuable contributions to the field. I think one of the things that stood out for me, and I'm sure most people that were around him, was just his love for fun. I mean, there was never a dull moment around Joe unless you were in a serious discussion. He loved life. He loved fun. He loved his family. He loved his friends. He loved sharing ideas and getting involved with anything and everything. And I could probably talk forever about stories about Joe, as those of us that knew him well could. But, I remember snippets of things that I'll tell you about, like when he rode a scooter through the exhibit area at one of the national conferences. I keep thinking, of the fact that he was just taken from us way too soon. Way too soon. We all benefited so much just by knowing him.
Okay, so Dr. Fred Kremkow shares how we have to be thankful.
But the thing that I remember about his talks, even though I don't remember the specific subjects, was that he was technically very accurate. And then I found out why, because he majored in physics as an undergraduate. Things that he was concerned about. One in the 2019 Doppler velocity estimates of internal carotid artery stenosis. Subtitle, angle correction parallel to the color Doppler lumen versus parallel to the artery wall. So there's a fundamental question. Which way are you going to set the direction indicator, which sets the angle that's going to be put into the Doppler equation and determines the result on the vertical axis of the spectral display of what you think the peak velocity or any other velocity is, because he is a physicist and because he really did love to get into the complications and the details. But what he wanted to do was, the end result of all of that is, let's get a simple result that people can act on and put into practice in their practice, and hopefully make it better than it was. So you just have to be thankful for what you had. And when you lose it, like we've lost Joe now, as painful as that is, all that is really is a measure of how good it was when we had it. How good Joe's friendship was, how good Joe's contributions to the field were. And it's when you lose these things that it hurts, but that is a measure of how good it was, and we have to be thankful that we had it. We certainly wouldn't want to say, well, I wish I never knew Joe so that I wouldn't feel the sadness of losing him. Of course not. Of course not. And so we're thankful for his friendship. I'm thankful for all the discussions we had. I'm thankful that we were on stage together a lot. I'm thankful that we published together at his prompting. And I'm thankful for the friendship that we did have.
The last conversation was with his daughter, Alex Polak. I first met Alex maybe when she was 10. She's a full-grown woman, has her master's in, I think, machine learning, AI, etc., much like her father, a mathematician. And Joe brought her to a local Greater Boston vascular technologist meeting, and I asked her to introduce him as the speaker, and she got up there and she said, I'm going to introduce you to my dad. Dad, do you want to come up here and talk? And so here's what Alex had to share about her father.
He's a very methodical person, and it obviously, I mean, deeply thoughtful. So all of the things that they were saying at swim camp about kind of feeling the water and understanding, like the hydrodynamics of it, he just took it all, and he kind of was able to explain it back to me because I was a little bit younger, and he just had a great understanding of physics, I guess. Yeah, his father's basement up in Canada in Montreal, absolutely filled to the brim with. He had like a working model of the solar system. All of these, just crazy. I saw it. I was like, this is it's like a mad scientist there. It's absolutely astonishing. The type of person that he was, it's becoming clear, just shone through in every aspect of his life. He loved food. Mm-hmm. He loved his T-shirts. He loved his hats. He was just he was the best dad in the world. I mean, what can I say? And I think that there's some merit to that because he was an amazing person. And like you said, did so much for people to teach. He absolutely loved learning. At the age of 50, he was just a lifelong learner, and he never stopped. He never stopped working. He still, had plans, and he had a wealth of interest and knowledge in the field. Anita, I know that, we talked about this as well. He never stopped, and he had so much to give to the world. And I think he realized, that he had a unique way of looking at things. And that could be used to help people and to just to help. But now looking at it in hindsight, it paints this picture of this guy who just, had so much to give and tried so hard. It really, he left it all on as for the dancing, he left it all on the floor, he really.
everyone that we had a conversation with wanted to have a toast for Joe. So the people that contributed, I asked to join us here today. You can raise your glass of coffee, your water, your wine, whatever you have in front of you. Joe loved life. He loved his work, and he loved vascular ultrasound, and he loved our society. And he loved everything about what we did and how we did it, and supported us endlessly. So, toast to Joe.